What I want to turn my attention to now is the relationship of the hierarchy of courts to the doctrine of precedent. Now, in order to do this, I think I need to explain certain terms and to remind you of certain key themes. What I've been talking about so far relates essentially to the kind of work the courts do and the distinction, if you like, between their civil and criminal jurisdiction and their appellate jurisdiction and their jurisdiction as a trial court, a court of first instance. Once we turn our attention to the hierarchy of courts and the doctrine of precedent, we're actually dealing with a related but distinct concern. As we know, the common law is one way of thinking about judge-made law. In other words, the power that judges have to develop the rules and principles of common law. Now, judicial lawmaking clearly needs to be coherent, rational, and guided. One of the things that allows judicial lawmaking to be coherent, rational, and guided is the structure of the courts, which, as we will see, relates to the doctrine of precedent. The doctrine of precedent is very difficult to describe in a sentence, but we at least need a working thesis, a working idea, working description of the doctrine of precedent in order to understand its relationship with the hierarchy of courts. Now, all I'm going to say about the doctrine of precedent at the moment, and it might sound rather simplistic, and I suppose at root it is quite a simple idea, is that like cases are treated in the same way. In other words, it relates to the idea that if we have a precedent case, a case that lays down a rule of law, a principle of law that will stand as precedent, then when a court hears a later case which is similar in law and fact as that precedent case, that later case will be bound by the earlier case, which takes us to this key idea that it's a binding doctrine of precedent. Now, I think this idea of the binding doctrine of precedent is the key idea that takes us back to the relationship of the courts to the doctrine of precedent. In other words, what we're concerned with here is the extent to which one court can bind another court. In other words, the extent to which a court can lay down a rule or principle of law which is binding on other courts in the, well, below it in the hierarchy, or at least at the same level of it in the hierarchy. And I suppose in saying that, I'm taking you towards the main idea here. And this, again, I think brings into clear focus the idea of the hierarchy of the courts. The doctrine of binding precedent, in a nutshell, in a sentence, tells us that courts inferior in the hierarchy are, and this is a general rule of thumb, bound by courts superior to them in the hierarchy. The general rule of thumb is that courts at the same level are also bound by the rulings of those courts. Now, that sounds a little bit mysterious, and these are the terms that I now want to explain in much more depth in looking at the various powers of the various courts in relation to the doctrine of precedent. The interesting thing here is obviously we're going to go back through the courts that we know, the Magistrates' Court, the Crown Court, High Court, etc. Although we'll see that perhaps the important thing for the development of the doctrine of precedent or the development of the law is the work of the higher courts in the hierarchical structure, in other words, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. I'm saying nothing here about the development of EU law in relation to the ECJ, and I'm saying very little at this stage about the way in which human rights law, those rulings determined by the other European International Court, the European Court of Human Rights, relates to precedents in UK law. These are complex matters that I will pick up on later on. We have to keep some things for later. So, to return to the hierarchy of courts and to think about which courts bind other courts, that's the next thing that we're thinking about. So let's go down to the bottom of the hierarchy, if you like, and think about magistrates' courts and county courts. So, these courts, magistrates' courts and county courts, are bound by the decisions of the High Court, the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. Magistrates' courts and county courts are not bound by their own decisions, nor do they bind any other court, although they are expected to exercise consistent decision-making, which will mean in practice they tend to follow their earlier rulings. This takes us to the Crown Court. Criminal court, remember, primarily. The court is bound by decisions of the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords, Supreme Court. I'm going to have to use those words interchangeably. The House of Lords is now the Supreme Court, but we'll be looking at cases later on where we're referring to the House of Lords. So when I say the House of Lords, I'm also making a distinction between the House of Lords and the Supreme Court. The House of Lords is now the Supreme Court. So, in relation to the Crown Court, the Court is bound by decisions of the Court of Appeal and the House of Lords Supreme Court. Its decisions, at least those reported as of interest, the decisions of the Crown Court, that is, are generally regarded as persuasive and worthy of being used in argument, particularly those made by High Court judges sitting in the Crown Court. I use the word there, persuasive. This is another term of art that I'll explain in passing. We can make a distinction between persuasive and binding precedent. I'll go into detail on this point much later on. A persuasive precedent is not binding. Perhaps that's the key thing that we need to know for a moment. In other words, it will persuade a later court to take a certain position, but it doesn't compel it to. It's not binding. Right, that was the Crown Court, the High Court, primarily a civil court, remember. The divisional courts of the High Court. The decisions of the divisional courts of the High Court are binding upon High Court judges sitting alone, and also the inferior courts, except the Employment Appeal Tribunal. The divisional courts of the High Court are bound by the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, and also by its own decisions. This takes us to the Court of Appeal, Civil Division. Generally, the decisions of the Court of Appeal Civil Division are binding upon the divisional courts of the High Court, individual High Court judges, and the inferior courts, including the Employment Appeal Tribunal. This takes us to the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. This appellate court is bound by the House of Lords, the Supreme Court, and is generally bound by its own decisions, but not so rigidly as in the Civil Division, since the liberty of the appellant is often at stake. The House of Lords. Now I'm going to talk about the House of Lords and the Supreme Court, but let me talk about the House of Lords first of all. There is an important piece of law that the House of Lords passed in 1966, the Judicial Practice Statement of 1966, which we will look at later on. The most important thing to remember about the 1966 Practice Statement is it states that the House of Lords is no longer in certain limited circumstances bound by its own previous decisions. In other words, the House of Lords gives itself the power to depart from its own previous decisions, although it stresses that this power will only be used in very narrow circumstances. The Supreme Court, in a later piece of law, which I'll talk about again in a different lecture, inherits this power. In other words, the Supreme Court can also depart from its own previous decisions in certain limited circumstances. Obviously, the decisions of the House of Lords Supreme Court bind all the courts below it in the hierarchy.